welcome. I am Tara Swiger, and I help makers and artists feel confident about their businesses. Today, I'm going to talk about my reading plans for 2020. A few years ago, I was only ever reading business books and sociology books, and I wanted to read more fiction. And one of the things that have helped me with that is like challenges that give you specific prompts. And what I love is from bookriot.com. They do a yearly challenge with 24, I think, prompts, and the 24 prompts basically challenge you to read things you might not normally pick up. So there's a wide variety of prompts, whether like horror or romance or graphic novels. We're going to talk about a lot of books. I have books for each of the 24 challenges that I have read and would recommend to you, and then books I plan on reading for the 24 challenges. Now, what always happens is I come up with a list at the beginning of the year, but I end up finding other books as the year goes on, so I don't always read exactly what I say I'm going to read. But I think it's fun to just get ideas. So if you want to join me in reading like more broadly, more interestingly, you can join me in the challenge. So it's at bookriot.com. I'll link it up in the show notes on Facebook. Let's just get right directly into what I'm going to read. First step in the Read Harder Challenge is to read a YA nonfiction book. What the heck? I hardly read any YA, so I actually have no suggestions from my own reading. These are all suggestions I haven't read yet. The first one is this is a suggestion I found online that has been on my list to read for a long time. It's a classic, and that is, the first one is by Corrie ten Boom. So her book, The Secret Hiding Place, or The Hiding Place, it's called something like that, is apparently YA nonfiction. So that's on the list. The other one is also like a memoir, and it's called Americanized. It's by a refugee from Iran. One that looks really good is Bonnie and Clyde, The Making of a Legend. That's by Karen Blumenthal. And I don't know what makes it YA, but I need to read about Bonnie and Clyde. Now, the one I'm most likely to read, this one is a star because it's the one I'm most likely to read, it's called The Faithful Spy, Dietrich Bonhoeffer and the Plot to Kill Hitler. This is a, I guess, YA appropriate historical telling of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And I have just recently been reading his letters. He is a classic of the Christian faith theology. And if you guys have any suggestions for these categories, please speak up. Give me your suggestions. I would appreciate them greatly. The next prompt is read a retelling of a classic of the canon, a fairy tale or a myth by an author of color. So the only book I have to recommend that is like this, I've read several retellings of Jane Austen books, but none of them are by authors of color, until I realized Beloved by Toni Morrison is a retelling of the Medea tale. If you haven't read Beloved, I don't want to ruin it for you, but in the Medea tale, a mom kills her children. Beloved, the mom does something slightly different for a slightly different reason. It is so good. I read it in college. I distinctly remember lying on my dorm room bed my freshman year, bawling my eyes out for all of it and like thinking about it nonstop. So that is one I heartily recommend as a retelling of I guess it would be a retelling of a myth. What is on my list to read is one of these three books. All of them look so good. So A Blade So Black is a retelling of Alice in Wonderland, except for that Alice is like a kick-ass ninja assassin type person. She's a woman of color, and it is written by a woman of color, and it I think actually has a couple books in the series. But A Blade So Black was actually recommended by my librarian who follows me on Instagram. She made a recommendation. If you guys have a recommendation for a retelling of a classic by an author of color, let me know. I also want to suggest these two have been on my list for a long time, so I will most likely read them this year too. Pride and Prejudice and Other Flavors by Sonali Dev is Pride and Prejudice set in a Indian family, and I think it's a gender swapped Pride and Prejudice. So then Aisha at Last by Uzma Jalaluddin is the next prompt, the third prompt, is to read a mystery where the victim is not a woman. So a mystery where the victim's not a woman, or the victims. This is really hard. Like, I had a hard time figuring out, how would you know a mystery before you've read it who the victim is? Like, that's often something that's like not told in the summary of the book. So I have two suggestions from books I recently read. The first one is A Brutal Telling by Louise Penny. It's the fourth book in the Louise Penny Three Pines or Inspector Gamache mystery. Real good. Real like. I would recommend reading them in order, but if you jump right to book 4, you're going to be fine. And then also I read last year The Better Sister by Alifair Burke. It is a story of two sisters who live very different lives and a mystery brings them together. And so The Better Sister by Alifair Burke is a mystery where the victim's not a woman. And then I remembered, like one of the big books of last year, The Witch Elm by Tana French. If you love Tana French's Dublin Murder Squad series, The Witch Elm is much different. And it's not a spoiler to say the victim's not a woman, because one of the first victims is a narrator of the story and he is a dude. And over the unfolding of the book, he deals with his white male privilege a lot. It's super interesting. It's very interesting. It's a very big book. I suggest Witch Elm by Tana French. Now, then I realized, oh my gosh, I have a book on my bookshelf, why didn't I get these books out before I started talking? The Murder of Roger Ackroyd by Agatha Christie. Totally is about the murder of Roger Ackroyd. So he's a dude. And it's a classic. And I actually had this on my list for a readathon because it was like read books recommended by a friend. Read your friend's favorite book you haven't read. And Jolie of joliecreates.com told me I should read The Murder of Roger Ackroyd. So that's on the list. Next, the next prompt is a graphic memoir. Take the suggestion to you that if you have not already, you read Mouse. Oh, you can't see it over here. So Mouse by Art Spiegelman is one of the classics of comics. There's actually a whole new book out about how Mouse is made, how it works really, really well. It's entirely done in black and white. It is a survivor's tale. It is the story of the author's father talking about his experiences in World War II as a Jewish man. Mouse is the story of Vladek Spiegelman, a Jewish survivor of Hitler's Europe, and his son, a cartoonist who tries to come to terms with his father's terrifying story, and history itself. It's so good. It's so moving. Be prepared to cry and love it. Okay? Just read it. Just read Mouse. Even if you're not going to do the Read Harder challenge. The other two graphic memoirs I'd recommend is Persepolis, which is a story of a whole period of history I didn't even know about, which is the fall of the Shah in Iran and what happened to people during the Iranian Revolution, but it's told from the perspective of like a 14-year-old girl who's going through it. It's a true story. And then another one, which I recommend for anybody who has anybody in their life who has mental health issues, is Marbles. And the subtitle is Mania, Depression, Michelangelo, and Me by Ellen Forney. And Ellen Forney is the memoirist, the cartoonist who is dealing with, it's right after her 30th birthday, she gets diagnosed with bipolar disorder. And she is working through the diagnosis. She's working through medication. She's working through what's working for her. And she had another book come out recently, which is more about how to manage it. I have that on my shelf somewhere, how to manage her mental health and what helps her. I'll link it up. But Marbles is her memoir. It's so good. It is the best description of living with mental health, like depression or anxiety or mania, that I have ever read. I tell everyone to read Marbles. So that's Persepolis, Mouse, Marbles, and then I am going to read those three that I just mentioned. Can heartily recommend. I am going to read March. I'm going to try to read all three books. So this is the graphic memoir of John Lewis, who is, of course, a senator and was extremely pivotal in the civil rights movement of the 60s, and specifically the March on Washington with MLK Jr. So I have been looking forward to this forever. He worked with Andrew Aiden and Nate Powell to tell a story in graphic form, which just makes it so much more powerful. Look at that page. It's so great. Is it all black and white? I guess it is. I didn't realize that, which is fantastic. So I'm going to be reading March. hopefully all 3 of them. They're 3 volumes. Prompt is to read a book about a natural disaster, and I have some suggestions for those. So I read Station 11 by Emily St. John Mandel. The book Station 11 is a book about art and Shakespeare and how the Star Trek quote, survival isn't enough. Like, you also need art and beauty in order to thrive after a disaster. And the natural disaster that happens in Station 11 is the flu, a version of the flu that wipes out a huge percentage of the population. So it is a apocalyptic, not fantasy at all, super grounded in real life, except for this apocalyptic thing has happened. Post-apocalyptic, that's it. And so I really recommend that book, but I have a couple other recommendations I've gotten from other people. One is The Age of Miracles by Lauren Thomas Walker. I think it is a mystery thriller that happens after a natural disaster. Salvage the Bones by Jessamine Ward is set in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina in the South. One family salvaging the bones from that natural disaster. What I plan on reading, and you'll see this book come up a couple times, is the Broken Earth series by N.K. Jemisin. The 5th season is number 1. What happens in this book is basically the fantasy book set in a world where natural disasters keep happening. The earth basically keeps falling apart, and ages end and rise, and humanity survives through all this stuff happening. So that is a natural disaster story, but it's fantasy, because that's the thing, is you don't have to read about, there was my bookmark, like real natural disasters. You can read about imaginary ones. So the Broken Earth series by N.K. Jemisin, that's what I'm going to read for that. It's a big one. The next prompt is to read a play by an author of color or a queer author. Book Riot has already released a list of books that fit this, so I suggest you check that out. I'm going to put this up a little bit. Hold on. I'm going to read something by Tennessee Williams. I never read any Tennessee Williams in college or high school. Isn't that amazing? So I'm totally looking forward to that. If you have a favorite Tennessee Williams play, tell me, because I'm going to read something by him. Now, the next prompt is to read a historical fiction novel not set in World War II. Because if you noticed, tons of historical fiction is set in World War II. So my first recommendation for you is one of my all-time favorite books is Wolf Hall by Hilary Mantel. We read this right after watching The Tudors on HBO. So if you enjoyed The Tudors, it's set in the exact same time. It's set in 1520s England. It follows Thomas Cromwell go from like a peasant with nothing to the most powerful man in England and kind of controlling Henry VIII. So if you like Henry VIII stuff, Wolf Hall by Hilary Mantel is amazing. The writing is gorgeous. It feels like poetry. It's amazing. Also just finished Underground Railroad by Colson Whitehead. So that is historical fiction with it's a twist, like a kind of fantasy or magical realism twist, where the Underground Railroad that took slaves out of the South to the North is real. It's a real railroad, like with steam engines and tracks and everything. But other than that, it's extremely historical. I have several that I plan on reading this year that are historical fiction not set in World War II, because I just looked at my shelves and I realized I had all of these. So actually, because we were just talking about the Underground Railroad, let's talk about Ta-Nehisi Coates' The Water Dancer. So this is set in the antebellum South, in other words, the South during slavery. I'm not sure what years, but it is also a little bit of magical realism in that there is someone who can control water. There is a enslaved person who has the ability to control water. And A Woman is No Man by Etaf Rum. This is actually follows 3 generations of Palestinian American women. So it's set in Palestine in 1990. Oh my gosh, I can't believe that's historical fiction now. I'm so old. And Brooklyn in 2008. So A Woman is No Man counts as historical fiction. Also, historical fiction, there was another book set in the 90s. Oh, The Girl Who Smiled Beads is set in Rwanda in the 90s. So that's on my list. And The Song of Achilles by Madeline Miller. If you loved Circe, Circe, you could read Circe by Madeline Miller, which is set in Greek mythology. It's a really long time ago. And on my list to read is The Song of Achilles, which is her earlier book, which follows the story of Achilles and his partner during the Trojan War. So way before World War II. If you guys have a suggestion for historical fiction not set in World War II, I would like to hear it. I'm always open to that. Now, the next prompt is something I never do, which is to read an audiobook of poetry. So I have no suggestions for this. My favorite poet for a long time, I'm looking to see on his shelf, is Jacques Prévert. I have his book in French, Parole, which I really love. I also love Rainer Maria Rilke. I always feel like I'm saying it wrong. And one of my college faves was Jewel. She has a book of poetry called A Night Without Armor, and it's night like N-I-G-H-T, like nighttime. So A Night Without Armor. I'm sure that there's an audiobook of that, and I bet Jewel reads it. So if you want to try one of those, I recommend that. I'm going to read Dog Stories by Mary Oliver. I love Mary Oliver, the poet, and her Dog Stories is all about poems about dogs. So that's what I'm going to listen to. The next prompt is to read the last book in a series. So this is where my N.K. Jemisin book can come in if I read all 3 books in this. Also, I've been reading the Louise Penny Inspector Gamache series. She puts out a new one almost every year, but so I'm on book number 6 now, and book 15 just came out in 2019. So if I read all of that, or I read all through that and then read the one she releases in 2020, I should be, there you go, the last book in a series. Of course, she's going to come out with a new one, but those are my plans. Finish N.K. Jemisin and or finish the Louise Penny series. Now, the next prompt is, and by the way, reading the last book in a series, I think anybody could do this. Any series you've started, just finish it. There you go. So read a book that takes place in a rural setting. One I really want to recommend is Foe by Ian Reid. It is very thin, and it is set super creepy, kind of sci-fi future maybe, on a farm in the middle of nowhere, and that's part of what makes it creepy. So it's Foe by Ian Reid. Definitely read it. Another book that's set in a rural setting that you might not think of because it's nonfiction is Animal Vegetable Miracle by Barbara Kingsolver. This came out, I don't know, a decade ago. It's actually set very near me in Abingdon, Virginia. That's 30 minutes away. So go read that. Also, one of my favorite books of the last year, Turn of the Key by Ruth Ware, is set in the middle of the Scotland Highlands, in the middle of nowhere. A nanny goes to live with this family, be a live-in nanny, and they live in a smart home. And it is a kind of domestic thriller. It's loosely has the same kind of thriller elements as Henry James' Turn of the Screw. And it's very good. Turn of the Key by Ruth Ware, also set in a rural setting. And I really don't know what I'm going to read. One of the only books on my reading list that I know is set in a rural place is The Bookwoman of Troublesome Creek. It is set in rural Kentucky, and a woman has a bookmobile that she takes around to the rural people in Kentucky. And that's on my list, but I don't know if that's what I'll read. I don't know. When I got it before, I was like, So the next suggestion is to read a debut novel by a queer author. So one that I read in 2019 that was great, that fills this, is actually by a non-binary author, Rivers Solomon. And they wrote the book An Unkindness of Ghosts, which is a set in space sci-fi adventure. It's kind of a post-apocalyptic, people live on a spaceship, things happen, and it plays with gender in a really, really interesting way. So that's An Unkindness of Ghosts by River Solomon. I really want to read a book that came out this year that people love, On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous by Ocean Vuong. So that was his debut novel, and I'm super looking forward to that. If you have any suggestions for a debut novel by a queer author, I am super happy to hear it. Now, this next one I got super excited about because I love these kind of books. And they are memoir by someone from a religious tradition or lack of religious tradition that is not your own. In other words, if you grew up in a religious tradition, read someone else's tradition, or one of someone raised in no religious tradition, like an atheist. So there's like a huge selection. Or if you're a read atheist, choose one written by any kind of religious tradition. I love, this is something I just realized is a thing, like memoirs of people who have escaped from a cult. So even though that is not what you have to do with this, you could read you could read, if you're not Jewish, read a book written by a memoir written by any Jewish person, like Night by Elie Wiesel, which is on my list and I still haven't read, or Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. Like those would count too. Those are obviously not cult books. The cult books on my list are Escape by Carly Jessup. She was raised in a fundamentalist Mormon polygamous family, and she escaped. That's on my list. I have read Troublemaker by Aaliyah Ramini. I think it was one of the first books I read in 2019. So good. She used to be Scientologist. You know, if you've watched the A&E series this year, that she escaped from Scientology. So that's Troublemaker. Really fun to read. Leaving the Saints by Martha Beck. Also very much enjoyed her leaving the LSD church. LDS. I'm very sorry for getting that wrong. And then on my list in the like cult memoirs, been on my list for a while, is Unfollow by a woman who left the Westboro Baptist Church. And yeah, so I will probably read either Unfollow or Escape. Both one-word books, both about leaving a cult. I recommend for you, like just a religious memoir that is probably not your religious upbringing, Troublemaker by Leah Remini. And if you're not LDS, reading Leaving the Saints by Martha Beck is about leaving the LDS church. I really like when people leave their backgrounds. I don't know why. This one I was really having a hard time with. Read a food book about a cuisine you've never tried before. Now, this could be a cookbook, or this could be a memoir, or this could be one of those like travel food writing kind of books, which I love. So these are all books that are on my list. Obviously, if I've read a food book, probably Eaten the Cuisine. Like this last year, I read several books by Ruth Reichel, who was first the food editor at the New York Times and then became the editor-in-chief at Gourmet Magazine. She writes about a lot of like basic American food. So unless you live in a country and you haven't had like food served in American restaurants, then that's not going to count for you. So one of the books that have just been on my list that I want to read is Notes from a Young Black Chef. And he is both, he's American, but he goes back to Nigeria as a kid and he cooks some Nigerian food. So I was like, well, that's kind of like, I haven't had Nigerian food, so that could maybe count. And then the book, Eating Korea. I don't have the author's name here, but they travel all through Korea and eat the traditional Korean food and write about it. It's not a cookbook. It's just like a travel memoir. Also on my list is Apricots on the Nile, which is set in Egypt. Haven't had Egyptian food that I know of. And Days of Honey, which is a memoir of growing up in Iran and Iraq. It's a lot about food, growing up in Iran and Iraq. So I don't believe I've had that kind. It really depends on how you classify it. But so I will probably read, I'm going to read Notes from a Young Black Chef anyhow, because I like chef memoirs. And for this challenge, I'm probably going to read Eating Korea or Days of Honey. The next book was also really hard for me because this is just a type of book I don't read a lot of. And that is Read a Romance starring a single parent. It's like, how do you do this? Let me tell you, the book, and I'm about to curse, so prepare yourself. The book smartbitchestrashybooks.com actually has a book finder on it. So it's all about romance books. They love romance books. The title is In Jest. And they have like where you can put in a trope that if you want to read books where they're like enemies to friends, or they're Like the trope is they're stuck on an island together, or the trope is it's like historical, like Regency or Old West or whatever. You can put that in, and you can also put in an archetype. So like a single parent, a firefighter, a bookstore owner, like all different kinds of archetypes, and they will give you lists of books. So that I heartily recommend. And that's how I realized that a book I had already read called Friday Night Knitting Club. Do you guys remember that book? It came out like forever ago. That stars a single parent. So that would totally count if you want a knitting based book, as I know many of you knit. So this is Read a Romance starring a single parent. Friday Night Knitting Club totally counts. On my list is maybe Fumbled by Alexa Martin. Close to Home by Lisa Jackson, because Close to Home is actually filed as a mystery thriller. But there is a romance storyline that ends in a happily ever after, which is how you define a romance, is that the love story is important and that it ends either happily ever after or happily for now. That's the definition of a romance, but it could be any other kind of genre also. So it could be a dystopian post-apocalyptic future, or it could be set in space and be sci-fi. So if you have suggestions of books you've read that fill this, let me know. So Close to Home by Lisa Jackson is a mystery thriller. So that's on my list. Would Like to Meet sounds really cute. It is one of those where a woman is an assistant for an author, and he has to write a rom-com. He's been like, has to write a rom-com, but he doesn't want to. And so he sends her on a series of adventures to like live out rom-com movies, like to do meet cutes with people, like by bumping into a cute guy at the coffee shop or something like that. And the whole book is about her like basically living out rom-com tropes. And it's called Would Like to Meet, and there is a single parent a single father, apparently. So that's on my list, Would Like to Meet. Also on my list is Tempest by Beverly Jenkins, because Tempest is also historical fiction set in the Old West, with a woman of color as the Tempest stuck out to me because I found it on that website, and it starts out by she is a mail order bride, sent to the Old West, and she shoots her fella upon meeting him. And it's really more about her adventures in the Old West. And it reminded me so much of the books I grew up reading about mail order brides going to the Old West. It was a lot of Christian historical romance when I was a kid. So Tempest by Beverly Jenkins is probably what I'll read. So the next prompt is a book about climate change. And so for that, the book I've read before that I will recommend to you, also by Barbara Kingsolver, Prodigal Summer, is about climate change, but it's not about climate change. It's just what happens. And then the book I'm going to read for this prompt about a book about climate change is Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer. The subtitle is Indigenous Wisdom, Scientific Knowledge, and the Teachings of Plants by Robin Wall Kimmerer. I've heard this is really, really good. And several of you suggested this book for this topic, for this prompt. So I'm going to read Braiding Sweetgrass. But really, any of the more recent Barbara Kingsolver books fit this. Also, I'm fairly sure that climate change is a major portion of what causes the earth to break apart in N.K. Jemisin's The Fifth Season. Speaking of that, the next prompt is to read a Doorstopper, a book over 500 pages that was published after 1950 that's written by a woman. So the first book that came to my mind that fit this description is one of my all-time favorites. I've read it back in college and I am completely in love with it. Poisonwood Bible by Barbara Kingsolver. She fits a lot of these prompts, by the way, because she writes about rural settings. She writes about climate change because she is by training a biologist or an ecologist. And then she writes big books. So the Poisonwood Bible, so good. If you haven't read it, it's about missionaries who go to Africa and realize the whole premise is wrong. They don't understand the culture. So Poisonwood Bible by Barbara Kingsolver, thick book written by a woman, written after 1950. Also, I realized Harry Potter's book 4 through 7 fits this. They're all over 500 pages after book 4, and they would also fit the prompt to read the last book in a series. So if you read Harry Potter book 7, you'd read the last book of the series and you'd read a Doorstopper. So you'd fit 2 prompts with that one. And then once I got going, looking through my books that are over 500 pages that I've already read, I realized Wolf Hall by Hilary Mantel, which is that historical fiction set in 1520s England, also over 500 pages, written by a woman. The Secret History by Donna Tartt, another one of my all-time favorites. And then one of my books I'm most looking forward to, the second book in the series. The first book is Children of Blood and Bone by Tomi Adeyemi. I think I read this because one of the prompts last year was to read a fantasy by a woman of color, and this fit that bill, and it is so good. It is a fantasy that is grounded in African mythology, except that, unlike most books like that set in fantasy worlds, the hero of the story, the protagonist, the person who is overcoming great odds, is a girl, a 15 to 17-year-old girl of color, and she lives in this world where she needs to bring magic back to the world. And it has such a good magical system. It has such good mythology, like deep mythology, so beautifully written. That's Children of Blood and Bone by Tomi Adeyemi. Her second book is coming out like right now, like either December or January. Second book in the series, you know I'm going to go get that. And then another book, totally different, like a contemporary YA, is Carry On by Rainbow Rowell. That also fits this. And Witch Elm by TANA French, which is a darker mystery thriller, which fits the earlier prompt about a victim who's not a woman. On my list in this section is Middle Game by Shauna Maguire, which has been on my list forever, and which is a kind of creepy sci-fi mystery thing. And Life After Life by Kate Atkinson. Life After Life by Kate Atkinson follows a woman through generations, through a long, long life that she has, which is kind of a mystery. It's long. It's over 500 pages. And it was book number 2 on Entertainment Weekly did the greatest books of the decade. And Life After Life was book number 2. And I was like, okay, it's been on my shelf. I've been meaning to read it. I'm going to read it for this. I'm also going to read Middle Game. But the fact that Life After Life is, like, according to Entertainment Weekly, the second best book of the decade, I was like, okay, well, clearly I need to read that. So the next prompt is read a sci-fi fantasy novella. So a novella is under 120 pages. Read a sci-fi fantasy novella. And I was like, what the heck? But I heartily recommend to you the Wayward Children series by Shauna Maguire. The first one is called Every Heart a Doorway. It is a series about children who have found hidden portals. So they're portal fantasies. They've found a hidden door to a world that really suits them. So think Alice in Wonderland, think The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. But what happens when these children are plopped back into their original life after living in a world that they felt perfectly suited them? So a woman who this had happened to her as a child, she runs this home for wayward children, and she collects up these kids and helps them cope with their new realities. Sometimes they go back, sometimes they don't. The first book is about the school and about one particular new student. The second book follows someone into the story of the door they fell into, someone you had already met at the school in the first book. And the third book is what happens when the child of one of these children goes back to her mother's world. I need to read the fourth book, and I think the fifth book is forthcoming. Those are all novellas. They're all under 120 pages. I think the first one is like 96 pages. But also on this list is Space Invaders by Nona Fernandez, which looks so good, so interesting. It's sci-fi set in space, and it's translated. And I try to, another prompt from another challenge is to read a book in translation. And I like to read books in translation because it makes sure I'm not just reading American authors or English authors. So Space Invaders by Nona Fernandez on the list, looks good. It's like 90 pages. The next prompt, we're almost done too. The next prompt is to read a picture book with a human main character from a marginalized community. So I need help with this. I need a picture book with a human main character, which is hard enough. But the human main character is from a marginalized community. Now, I've read a lot of picture books about children of color, like that they are the main, we actually own several, so that we have a diverse bookshelf for our kids. But I want to go further than just that if possible. So one that I absolutely loved this year is Julian is a Mermaid. It's beautiful. It won a lot of awards. It has such beautiful watercolor art. And it's a little boy who sees these mermaids, drag queens dressed up as mermaids, and goes home and he puts on all of his abuela's fancy stuff to dress up as a mermaid. And then she takes him to a pride parade. I hope I'm not spoiling the end. That's how it ends. There's like no words in it. It's just beautiful photos. And that is a beautiful book that fits this. Another book that I haven't read yet is called Charlie and Emma. And it was written by a mother whose, I believe, child is in a wheelchair. And so it's about making friends with a little boy or a little girl who's in a wheelchair. I don't know who Charlie and Emma are. And so I am looking specifically for picture books with human main characters with a variety of disabilities or being differently abled or I feel like it's become easier and easier in past years to find books that feature kids of color, but it's still hard for me to find books that feature children with different abilities. And I want to have a diverse bookshelf so our kids are realize that there are differences in the world. You know what I mean? Like from as early an age as possible. Next prompt is read a book by or about a refugee. And I did not even remember that I read this book years ago, but it is so good. One of my favorites. I forgot that it's about a refugee, but it actually is about a whole refugee community living in the States. And that is called What is the What by Dave Eggers. So good. I read What is the What by Dave Eggers. Just read it and then like speak to me about it. On my list of possible books to read is Every Falling Star by Sunju Lee, which is also YA nonfiction. It is a memoir of a woman who came here as a refugee, I believe from North Korea. The Girl Who Smiled Beads, which is about a refugee from 90s Rwanda in the 1990s, the Rwandan genocide there. The Girl Who Smiled Beads. The book that I'm most likely to read, because it was on Entertainment Weekly's best book of the decades, and it was number 3 on that, is Exit West by Mohsin Hamid. I'm going to say Mohsin Hamid, and I'll look it up before I talk about it anymore to make sure I'm saying it right. It's called Exit West, and it was number 3 on the Entertainment Weekly list. Now, the next prompt is read a middle grade book that doesn't take place in the US or the UK. You guys, I'm having so much trouble with this. Somebody suggested Anne of Green Gables. Thank you for that. I loved Anne of Green Gables. If you haven't read Anne of Green Gables, I don't even know how you're my friend. You're not my friend. Go read Anne of Green Gables. What I haven't read, though, is Emily of New Moon, which is also by Ellen Montgomery, and also, I'm guessing, set in Canada, because that's where she's from. So if you have any middle grade books that are not set in America or the UK, I'd love to hear it. Another suggestion is, and this is the book I'm most likely to read, Amal Unbound by Aisha Saeed. It's set in around the Middle East. I think she travels around through several countries. Amal Unbound. Very much looking forward to that. If you have another suggestion, let me know. So the next prompt is read a book with a main character or protagonist with a disability, fiction or nonfiction. Okay, so for this, I really like the book, The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime. The main protagonist is on the spectrum, and it is told in his point of view, and I remember absolutely loving it. Another book, the main character is called Life with Charlie. It's a memoir about growing up with a sibling who has Down syndrome. And the book I'm most likely to read is Count Us In, Our Lives with Down Syndrome, written by 2 friends who have Down syndrome. And it's what I like about it is it's written by them, their perspective. The next one is also one that's hard for me, and that's to read a horror book published by an indie press. Now, I don't have any horror book suggestions because I can't think of any that I've read other than thrillers that might count as horror, but I don't want anything splattery. So I found The Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires by Grady Hendrix. Doesn't that sound amazing? It's about the suburban book club group full of moms in the 90s who have to start slaying vampires to save their town. So it's a mix between like Buffy and like a Jocelyn Jackson book, like a suburban moms together book. And it is considered horror. It's by an indie press, so you better believe I'm going to read Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires by Grady Hendrix. Now, the next prompt is to read an edition of a literary magazine, digital or physical. I plan to go to my library, pick up a literary magazine, and read it there. There are several that I like there. I was like, I'm not going to list all the possible ones. Just Google literary magazine, pick one that looks good, and read it. The last prompt is to read a book in any genre by a Native, First Nations, or Indigenous author. There are several on my list. The first is Braiding Sweetgrass, which, because it's also about climate change, I am likely going to read that. It's nonfiction by a Native woman. There is also a novel, Moon of the Crusted Snow. And these next two books have been on my list for a long time. They're There by Tommy Orange. I say a long time. I think that came out in 2019. It is a fiction novel that's kind of experimental. It's told in like 12 different perspectives about a time when First Nations people are coming together for a powwow, but told in different perspectives of the people who are coming by Tommy Orange, who is a Native American. And then the book Absolutely True Diary of a Part-Time Indian by Sherman Alexie is a YA fiction novel about the experience of being a teenager who grows up on the reservation and goes to a public high school full of people, full of white people who don't understand his life, and how he code switches between them. This fell off my list. I planned to read this last year, but it fell off my list after Sherman Alexie came out and admitted to having inappropriate relations with the women that he was mentoring and like taking advantage of them. I feel icky about him, but this book is like a modern classic, and so I'm really kind of divided. I'd love to hear your thoughts about what you're into, if you have another book to add to this list. And that is the end of the prompts for the Read Harder Challenge. I am going to include links to many of these books in the description. If you're watching on YouTube, it'll be down below. And I would love to hear your suggestions. Please leave a comment suggesting me books for any of these prompts. I will also link up to where you can find all the prompts. Book Riot is the place that created the reading challenge. And in their list of prompts, they also link to suggestions for every single one of the prompts. They do a blog post with 5 to 6 books on every single prompt, so you can check those out there. Thank you so much for joining me here. I hope you have a fantastic day and a week, and here's to like a really great reading year in 2020.